Karen was alone at home when she was maliciously robbed. The thieves were in and out in moments but took more than £2,000. By the time she realised, both they and her money were long gone. All she can remember was responding to an email from what she thought was her bank, asking her to confirm her security details. That was all the invitation the criminals needed.
You can't see cybercrime, but there are ways to avoid it. At Barclays, we'll never ask you to confirm your security details by email.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello. In this Moneybox podcast, disabled people fear they may be excluded from a £150 discount off their next winter fuel bill after the rules change later this year. The woman appointed to advise the government on how to end fuel poverty gives Moneybox her first interview. And if you have the money, there are 2 weeks left to top up this year's tax-free cash ISA. But is it a good idea? But first, Graham thought he was investing in cryptocurrency when he contacted a firm he found on the internet. He was fed up with poor returns on his savings and hoped to use it to help buy a home for his son. But he ended up losing his savings, his car and his house as thieves stripped him bare. Dan Whitworth's here. Dan, give us some background.
Well, Paul, I've worked with you and the Moneybox team for 3.5 years now, and sadly I've come across dozens, if not hundreds, of cases of fraud. And I have to say, having spoken to Graham, his family and friends for the last few days, this is the most comprehensive and devastating fraud I have ever reported on. It started last August when Graham was looking around for a better return on his savings. He came across a company online called N Capital, which has since disappeared, which was offering to help people invest in cryptocurrencies. Now, Graham's a widowed 77-year-old, but he's also served 22 years in the RAF and retired as a squadron leader, so he felt he knew what he was doing. Now, he started off investing a small amount, but was told the more he invested, the better deal he'd get.
How much did he put in to start with?
Well, it started off amazingly with just £50, but the next day it was £10,000, and in just a few weeks, Graham had been groomed by the criminals so completely he'd put in well over £100,000 worth of savings. Once they cleared him out of cash, they got him into tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt and had ruthlessly exploited him for every penny he had at his disposal.
And did the fraud stop there?
No, it didn't. And bit by bit, the criminals pulled him even deeper into their web. Now, they did this by convincing him there was a problem with the company he'd invested with, but that a second man, who called himself Jeff, could help him get all his money back and even make money on his original investment on top of that. But they'd need more money to do it. And so Graham, increasingly frantic to get his money back, was pulled even further and further into the fraud. In Graham's desperation, he ended up throwing more good money after bad.
A desperate story indeed, Dan. And as Graham told me when I spoke to him and his daughter Liz on Friday, he was suspicious, but that wasn't the end of it.
I began to fear that maybe there was a problem with this particular company and that I was not being given good advice. But at that stage, I had kept all of this investment to myself. I hadn't even told my children. I don't have a partner. I've been widowed now for 17 years. With lockdown and being stuck at home and all the other things that have gone on the last couple of years, I very much worked alone in the house.
So you'd run out of savings. You'd borrowed, I suspect, probably as much as you could. Was that the end of it?
No, because Jeff then said, look, because there's more money required, I would like you to take equity release on your house. We need between £300,000 and £400,000 to do this.
You'd borrowed £400,000. You'd spent all the money that you'd had. You'd taken out loans. Did he ask you for more money?
Yes, he wanted another $280,000 because of the loss in value of Bitcoin. But then to sell the house totally, which I was very reluctant to do, you can imagine that. Why would you want to sell your house? And he kept telling me, look, don't worry about it. I have got a team. I will buy your house back, and also you will get your full return, which was going to be valued at something like £1.4 million, something like that. I reluctantly agreed, very reluctantly agreed to sell my house because I wrote a long email to him expressing my concerns about saying it was a case of, I love my house. I've been in the house since it was built in 1990. My late wife and I raised our children there, our two boys anyway. So I was convinced, utterly convinced, that this guy was telling me the truth. He sent me an email back, calming me down to say that don't worry about it. You will not only get your investment back, but you will get your house back the day that the house goes on the market. I will buy it straight back. I have a team who will do that for you within a few days.
So you had used all your savings, you'd borrowed or had borrowed for you tens of thousands of pounds, you'd sold your house. When did you finally realise that something was terribly wrong?
Well, it all came to a head on the 8th of February when I tried to contact Jeff, because that was the day that he was supposed to have purchased the house and I should have had my investment returned in full. And I could not raise him. And then I had a WhatsApp message from his PA who said, Jeff's had a bad car accident and he's in hospital. And I thought, this has got to be a total fraud. It all came to a head at that stage. I thought, oh my God, I became very concerned. I was very frightened at what I'd done. I began to feel like a total idiot. I was very ashamed of myself. I hadn't told my children. I'd basically given away my whole life to this individual. And I pulled all the blinds and curtains down at my house. And my neighbor saw, she's a good friend, and she saw what I'd done. And she rang me up and she said, Graham, what's the problem? And she came over to my house. And then my son came and it all broke, and I admitted what I'd done. I was a complete, utter mess. I could not believe what I'd done. I'm 77 years old. I'm a mature man. I have fought in 2 wars. I have had a commission in the Royal Air Force, 22 years. I have flown around the world. I have operated around the world. I've lived in many countries. I have experienced death. I've experienced awful tragedies. And yet I have made this gross, terrible error of actually giving everything away to this fraudster. And I'm utterly appalled that I'm actually talking about this right now. It's very, very difficult to explain and to come on this program and break down like this. I'm so sorry.
Graham, don't apologise. Graham, take a short break because I'd like to talk to your daughter, if I may. Liz, you're there.
Hi.
This is where the family came in at that stage when your dad realised what had happened. What did you think when you heard of it?
Everybody was in complete shock. When something like that lands on you, you just don't know what to do. Once we sort of got over the initial shock, we needed to basically form a ring of steel around my dad. He's lost everything. These people are like thieves, but they're worse. To me, they're like murderers because they are actually killing somebody's future life. And it's not just the one person, it's the ripple effect that it has on the victim's family. So the key thing for us was to be there and support Dad. His mental health was our most important thing. And then from that, we had to go straight to the police. Listening to my dad speak now, I have been crying. It's awful to hear the story again. We needed to get him to help us to help him and sit down and go through it in as much of a factual way as we possibly could. And we've made contact with as many of the agencies and banks and people involved that we possibly can.
And Liz, what's your message to people who are listening?
The main reason we have agreed to do this is because I really hope it makes people so aware of what is out there. These people are awful. They have turned so many of our lives upside down. It's like we're living a different life. since the 8th of February. I cannot tell you how overwhelming and how much this has taken over the family. So I would just like everybody to be fully aware of the evil people that are out there and how easily people who don't believe they are vulnerable can so easily succumb to this and be groomed by these people. It is heartbreaking, and I do not wish this on absolutely anybody else.
Liz, ending that interview with her and her father, Graham. And Dan is still with us. Dan, how much in total did Graham have stolen?
Well, Graham told us he lost nearly £800,000. Now, the vast majority of that money was transferred out of two accounts, one with Santander and one with Barclays. Now, Barclays have told me they sympathise with Graham but cannot be held liable in this instance, so I've informed Graham he can take his complaint to the Financial Ombudsman Service. Santander told us they're also sympathetic and are reviewing the case. As for the quick house sale company which bought Graham's house, that's called Good Move UK, we've asked them a number of questions, including if they would agree to pause the completion of the purchase of Graham's home during an investigation by police. They didn't answer any of our questions and didn't feel it was appropriate to comment further on this matter when there could be potential legal proceedings at a future date.
Thanks, Dan. And important warnings to everyone in that tragic story. The government will soon announce changes to who is eligible to receive the warm home discount in England and Wales. This £140 payment off one winter electricity bill will be raised to £150 from next winter. The government says more people will qualify, 3 million altogether, but charities are warning that there will be more than 200,000 disabled people who may no longer get the payment. Rachel Tomlinson in East Yorkshire qualifies now because she gets personal independence payment, or PIP, but fears that she may lose the warm home discount when the rules change.
I'm currently in receipt of warm home discount because I get PIP, as I have multiple sclerosis and I have mobility issues. I also have a need for extra fuel because I use an electric wheelchair which needs to be trickle charged. I have a dishwasher and a tumble dryer because I can't bend down and up very easily. And I also have to keep warm because the cold really affects my limbs. Not being eligible for the warm home discount, it will throw me into further fuel arrears because I don't have a choice as to whether I use these things. I feel like we're getting knocked back from every angle at the moment with cost of living and everything else that goes with it.
With me is Louise Rubin, Head of Policy and Campaigns at the disability equality charity Scope. Louise Rubin, how do disabled people qualify for the warm home discount now?
Well, at the moment, if you receive disability living allowance or personal independence payment, DLA or PIP, and another means tested benefit, then you'll very likely qualify for the warm home discount. It's £140 off your bill. You have to apply for it. But in the new proposed system, that won't be sufficient. You'll have to demonstrate that you're also in fuel poverty as well as being on a means test benefit.
Yes, I think that it's going to be a sort of home hard to heat test, isn't it? How is that going to be assessed?
Well, what we know is that the government has a calculation, essentially, for working out fuel poverty. It looks at the size of your home and the characteristics of your home as well as your income. But by their own calculations, they've told us that over 200,000 disabled people who are currently on PIP or DLA, they won't qualify under the new rules.
And do you think that might apply to Rachel? Because, as she explained to us, she's got to use a lot of electricity for her equipment and heating just because she's disabled.
Well, it's difficult to say whether it will apply to Rachel. I hope that it won't. But what we think is that the government has completely missed the fact that most disabled people, like Rachel, they have huge extra costs in their lives. It's expensive being disabled. On average, disabled people have to spend an extra £600 a month compared to non-disabled people for the reasons that Rachel set out. So there's energy usage that cannot be reduced if you need to charge your ventilator or charge your electric wheelchair or use extra fuel to keep warm. Those things are unavoidable and you cannot reduce the usage. So what we're concerned about is that government looking at income alone is missing a trick here.
So the government says an extra 780,000 people will get it than do now, 3 million altogether. More of them will be in fuel poverty. That's a good thing as far as it goes, surely.
Well, of course, we welcome the fact that they are expanding the warm home discount and taking more people in, but it's the mechanisms behind it. It's a very blunt approach, and it looks rather like robbing Peter to pay Paul, in that they are removing 200,000 disabled people from the eligibility criteria.
And the publication of the plan to make these changes has been delayed, as I understand it, and on Friday the department couldn't even tell me when it will be published. What changes would Scope like to see before the plans are finalised?
Well, we want them to abandon this proposal altogether. It could not come at a worse time with the cost of living crisis that everybody is well aware of. We need them to abandon this proposal, and we need more support, more targeted support for disabled people, not less.
So keeping disabled people disability benefits as one of the criteria?
Absolutely. They need to abandon this proposal.
And briefly, when do you expect an announcement?
We hope to see an announcement in the spring statement next week. We really need an end to the confusion around this now.
Louise Rubin from Scope, thanks. And those planned changes are only in England and Wales. The scheme doesn't operate in Northern Ireland, and Scotland is expected to announce its own scheme later. Well, despite the warm home discount and other measures, Citizens Advice warns this week that 1 in 4 households will not be able to pay their electricity and gas bills in October if prices rise again, as they're almost certain to do. It's one of many predictions of a looming crisis as the cost of heating our homes rises much faster than our incomes. Latest figures show that in 2020, more than 3 million households were in what is called fuel poverty, unable to afford to heat and light their home. Now there are fears those numbers will grow. With me is Caroline Flint, the newly appointed chair of the government's Committee on Fuel Poverty. Caroline Flint, your committee advises the government on policies aimed at reducing fuel poverty. It seems it's likely to increase. Have the government's policies got it wrong?
There has been a sort of relatively steady decline of number of households in fuel poverty, but you're right. What's happened recently, and we haven't got yet the figures for during the pandemic to provide for us a more accurate figure, they're likely to rise. As you said, something like 3.16 million households are in fuel poverty. And along with that, during the pandemic, obviously, there wasn't as much possibility to get into people's homes and retrofit them in terms of energy efficiency. So we're very mindful that not only have we already missed the target in terms of getting fuel poverty households out of the lower bands for F and G for the milestone by 2020, with the present crisis we're facing, the recovery from the pandemic, a lot more thought is going to have to be given to this. And as well as holding on to the policies of making sure fuel poor households are supported with their bills, but also their homes are more energy efficient, I think the circumstances we're in at this present moment, for those families, but also those who aren't classed as in fuel poverty, more measures are going to be necessary.
So what does the government need to do? One rise in a couple of weeks, another probably even bigger one in October. And mutual insurance company Royal London, for example, said a fifth of people plan to borrow their way out of trouble, and a quarter of those will consider a payday loan. Does that worry you?
Of course it's worrying, because, for people to get more into debt to pay off a bill that they can't afford, that is not the place that we want families to be. And as has already been said on your programme, there is a statement shortly to happen, a spring statement by the Chancellor. And like all your listeners, I wait to hear what more will be done. We've already had the announcement of the £200 loan in October, and there's the £150 rebate happening, delivered at a local level. But given the headline figures we're seeing about the rise in prices, that it probably is not going to be enough. So we wait to hear. But what they could do is, as the committee has been saying, we want to see a ramping up of support and activity to deliver energy efficiency. People lose so much of what they pay in their energy bills, particularly in the fuel poor households, through what they lose for their windows and doors and walls. So we'd like to see long-term funding, home upgrade grant, and the social housing support, but also funding that can meet the target, so we can get back on target to get as many of those fuel poor homes out of those EFG brackets as soon as possible.
Yeah,
we want better targeting as well. At the moment, of all the money that's paid into this area, it's still a relatively small proportion that actually is directed to those families living in fuel poor households.
Yes, EFG being the energy efficiency of the home,
Yes.
of course, and your target is C. And very briefly, Caroline, you mentioned that the £200 and the £150 weren't enough. What should the Chancellor do in his spring statement on Wednesday, briefly?
Well, I think what he should show is that he is mindful of these exceptional circumstances that we are living in at the moment. For many families, that is not going to be enough to take away the worry and to pay their bills. So we will wait and see. Our job, though, at the end of the day, is whatever monies are provided is to make sure that the money is directed to those who most need it and it's used effectively to get us on track to bear down on this terrible situation we find ourselves in the 21st century with too many people living in fuel poverty.
Caroline Flint, Chair of the Government's Committee on Fuel Poverty, thanks. Now, if you have any spare money, you have just over 2 weeks to use this year's ISA allowance. The money must be paid into the tax-free ISA account by the end of the tax year on 5th of April. This year, the allowance is £20,000. So if you have paid in less than that into an ISA this tax year, you can top it up if, as I said, you have any spare money. But should you? With me is Anna Bowes, the co-founder of savingschampion.co.uk. Anna Bowes, we're talking today about simple cash ISAs. Are they less worthwhile than they used to be?
Well, they are. A few years ago, the personal savings allowance was introduced, and that means that everybody who's a basic rate taxpayer can earn £1,000 of cash interest and not pay tax on it. So suddenly the cash ISA became less valuable to people because they could already earn tax-free cash on their savings.
And you'd need quite a lot in an account to earn up to £1,000, wouldn't you? Even at current rates, they're slightly creeping up. So it's no longer the case that ISAs are the only way to avoid tax on savings interest. You can also have up to £1,000, and the average amount, I believe, in a cash ISA is £11,000. So you might as well put that sort of amount, if you've got anything like it, in a normal savings account.
Yeah, and if you haven't got any more than that, I know that is a large sum of money, but you know, and just basically the best 1 year bond at the moment is paying 1.71% with our Ryan Bank. Now, if you have £11,000 in that account, you'd be earning £188 a year in interest. So that's way below the personal savings allowance. So that, you know, that means that if you've got cash and you're not anywhere near the personal savings allowance, you might as well use a bond that is paying much better rates gross. And in some cases, even after tax is deducted from a normal bond, you still will be earning more than the equivalent cash ISA rate.
Now, people who want to put money in have got just over 2 weeks to get money in. How long does it take? The deadline's April the 5th, but I guess you have to start before that.
You do, and the 5th of April is a Tuesday, so you've got a weekend coming the few days before, so sometimes things slow up. The key thing is you have to get the money invested, so it's not about when you open the account, it's about when you fund it. So if you open it, and it could be that it's instant, if you do an online account, you'll find out at that point, but there's a couple of things to even then be aware of. If it's open and everything's gone clearly, you still need to make sure the money is moved, and sometimes there is a restriction on how much you can move per day. So make sure you're in advance, and if you don't do it smoothly, you might have to send in documentation for your ID.
And finally, Anna, several listeners have asked us about the low interest rates on cash. The Bank of England raised the bank rate again to 0.75%. Briefly, will that mean higher rates on our savings?
Well, it should do, and it already is. A year ago, believe it or not, the best 1 year ISA was paying 0.55%, and the best bond was paying 0.65%. So today you can get considerably more. You can get 1.25 on an ISA, 1.71, as I said, on a bond. So things have already improved, but you need to keep an eye on what your provider is doing. The high street banks, some of the high street banks have done nothing, and there have been 3 base rate rises now since December, and they have done nothing, and you're still earning 0.01% in some of those accounts. So move it.
Anna Bowes of Savings Champion, thanks. Well, that's just about it for this Moneybox podcast, but there's always more. You can hear it first by listening live every Saturday on BBC Radio 4 at midday, and then on Wednesdays we're back with Moneybox Live. The next one, if you catch it live, will be the first analysis of the Chancellor's mini-budget. But will there be any spring in his spring statement? Catch that live or catch up on BBC Sounds. You can contact us anytime with your money hopes and fears, moneybox@bbc.co.uk. We'd love to hear from you. We do read them all, and you may get on the programme. Today, the reporter was Dan Whitworth, producers Paul Waters and Louise Clark-Rowbotham, studio managers Rob Fanner and Nathan Chamberlain, production coordinator Janet Staples. Our editor was Richard Varden. I'm Paul Lewis, and this was a BBC News long-form audio production for BBC Sounds. And now, by contrast, some disinformation.
Death by Conspiracy, a new podcast from BBC Radio 4. Gary Matthews was an artist and photographer, a familiar sight on the streets of his hometown in Shropshire. But in the last few years, he was drawn to conspiracies. And when the pandemic hit, Gary, who was suspicious of experts, ignored the rules. When he died of COVID-19, his distraught family and friends were left searching for answers. I'm Mariana Spring, the BBC's specialist disinformation reporter, and I've been investigating what happened to Gary by delving into the conspiracy underbelly of the picturesque town of Shrewsbury. From BBC Radio 4, Death by Conspiracy, a new 10-part podcast series. Subscribe now on BBC Sounds.